Today, we're going to continue our mini-series on building a better band. And in this episode, we're going to look at the problem of authenticity. This is something that gets overlooked a lot in the band world, particularly by band directors, because they're the ones in charge of preserving authenticity. And, well, what do I mean by authentic? Well, basically it boils down to this. An authentic performance is one that preserves the composer's original intention. As simple as that. So, how do we preserve a composer's intention? Well, I think we need to look first at orchestral practice. An orchestra is going to bend over backwards to perform a piece exactly as the composer wrote it. They're not going to change parts. They're not going to leave out instruments. A band, on the other hand, has this long tradition of changing stuff. And part of this has to do with the band's long tradition of performing orchestral transcriptions. It's built into the inherent DNA of the wind band to change things. But this leads to inauthenticity. It leads to not preserving what the composer originally wrote. So I want to take a look at what is done in the orchestral world and what is termed historically informed practice, HIP. Now, there's a lot of different variations on HIP. And one of them is, look at a Baroque orchestra. Baroque orchestras today tend to go out of their way to be as historically accurate as possible. They will play on period instruments or reproductions of period instruments. They will use Baroque tuning, which is down a semitone from what we typically tune to today. They will go out of the way to study the performance practices, the ornamentation, the stylings, the articulation. It's a big, long process. And it's one of the things that I studied quite a bit as a graduate student. In fact, it was one of the more influential things I did in graduate school was to go and study historical bassoon practice. I took quite a few lessons in Baroque bassoon, and it really opened my eyes to the differences in how we play today versus how they played 250 years ago. Even if I were to take a modern bassoon and to play the Baroque music, after studying the historical practices, I would play the piece differently today than I would have before I studied those practices, because it is very different stylings. Now, the wind band has a long history, going back to the Baroque era and even before that, because we have wind band pieces in the Renaissance, and there are wind bands even into the late medieval era, what are called loud and soft bands. But we don't see that music performed on the wind band stage very often because, well, band directors around the world don't like changing up their ensemble. So there's a couple approaches that you can take. First approach is change the music to fit the ensemble. This means you're going to take an existing piece of music and mold it, arrange it, shape it to what players you have available. The other practice would be to take the piece of music you want to perform and then find the players that can perform that piece. Two very different approaches. The first version, where we change the music to fit the band, is the standard traditional way of performance in a wind band. The other way is a historically more accurate approach to change the band to suit the music. Take, for instance, a piece like Dionysiacs, one of my all-time favorite works for the wind band. And I can guarantee you, in the United States, that you have never heard live an authentic performance of this piece. Why? Because it uses a non-standard instrumentation. If you go and look at my Examining the Orchestration of Dionysiac series, you can see it's a very, very different band than we use here in the United States. A whole big family of sax horns, which are modern day flugelhorns, alto horns, baritone horns, and so on. 7 saxophone parts, only 2 trumpets and cornets. And these are things that we just don't typically see in a modern American style wind band. So an authentic performance of this doesn't happen. What does happen is we perform a modern performing edition of this work, which means that someone has gone and arranged it for a more traditional setting. This, to me, is an inauthentic performance because we have taken the composer's original intentions and changed it to something else that better suits our immediate needs. We have changed the music to fit the band instead of changing the band to fit the music. Now, changing the band to fit the music is much, much more difficult to do. If you want to do an authentic performance of Dionysiacs, you have to go and find all these instruments. You have to go and find at least 4 B-flat flugelhorns and a soprano flugelhorn, which is almost unheard of. You have to find the alto horns, the baritone horns, and a bass saxophone, and all these unusual instruments that would have been found in the French band at the time. It's just easier to do the modern version. But you're not being authentic in it. You are changing the composer's needs. Now, if this same piece existed in an orchestra, say it's The Rite of Spring, the orchestra is going to bend over backwards to make sure that they had every instrument that Stravinsky wrote for. And this is a big, big difference between orchestral perspective versus band perspective. The band, we'll just change it, we'll fit what we've got, gotta leave out something, we're good. Orchestra, you play that note that the composer wrote, you played exactly as the composer wrote it, on the exact instrument that the composer wrote it, no questions asked. So, if we want to build a better band, we've got to start leaning toward more authentic performances. And this means we have to follow the composer's intention. Otherwise, what we're doing is just regressing to the mean, making everything as easy as possible. And if we make everything as easy as possible and just kind of sand over all the rough edges, we're stuck in our conservative mode and everything stays the same. Nothing changes, nothing gets better, nothing gets worse, but it's just flat line. You've got a dead ensemble. If you aren't willing to experiment, to push, well, where's the growth coming from? So, if you want to build a better band, you first have to be authentic. You've got to respect the composer's original choices. Even if you don't agree with them, is it your place to change someone else's art? And this is a very, very difficult philosophical question. Do you have the right to change someone else's ideas? And this is something I've struggled with, and I come up with the answer, no. I don't have the right to change someone else's ideas. I am not that inauthentic. I want authenticity. I want to preserve what the composer, what the original artist did. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. Should bands be more authentic? And as always, like, comment, subscribe, and until next time, let's keep building a better band.